Let me just do a little lead in here. So our next guest left home at 16. He managed a Skid Row hotel and drove taxis in New York City. And then he went down to North Carolina and he became a union activist while working as a municipal bus driver. And that is Phil Cohen. And we've got Phil on the line. Phil, thanks for joining us.
Hey, good to be here.
So you're going to be in town here in D.C. in the eye of the storm.
Yes, I
am. Next Tuesday at the AFL-CIO. I've got a new book out that we're very excited about. It's called The Jackson Project, The War in the American Workplace. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit about how you went from being a taxi driver in New York City to North Carolina. That's an is that like a fair that had to go down there? What happened?
Well, actually, no. I guess I ended up down here for two reasons. One, I was young and following the thread of a relationship that ultimately didn't work out. But I always wanted to really get away from the mean streets of New York and live someplace closer to nature. So the two of those brought me down to North Carolina. And at the time, the one credential I had in the world was that I drove people around. So I got a job as a municipal bus driver, and there was a union there. It was an ATU local, and within a year, I ended up as the chief steward of that local and did some things that got me some profile with the media and connected to the greater labor movement. And in 1988, I was hired as a lead organizer by what was then the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union.
Act Two. I remember them well. Yep. So when you started organizing, and this is the basis of your book, The Jackson Project, War in American Workplace. I mean, obviously, it's a fascinating story. We're just going to sort of get to a little bit here, sort of tantalize folks. They should really just come and hear your talk next week to get the full details. But you really kind of waded into the middle of things there, didn't you?
My role with the union from the beginning was as a troubleshooter. I was sent into those situations that were the most desperate, sometimes dangerous, where conventional tactics didn't work. And my assignment was pretty simple. Turn things around, shift the balance of power by any means necessary, no questions asked. So I kind of lived my career in the eye of the storm. And the campaign in Jackson, for a number of reasons, was one of the most extreme and interesting campaigns that I was involved in, this being at an old textile mill in Jackson, Tennessee.
So here, when I was thinking about this, I was realizing that a lot of folks, have probably grown up, in a world where, all the textile jobs have gone abroad. But when you started organizing, there still was a pretty big textile industry right here in this country that had moved down south to get away from unions.
Yeah, that's correct. And we actually had a very, very large presence. I mean, the two biggest unions in the South at the time was Act Two and the Teamsters. Mm-hmm. And this was, a number of years before NAFTA and other free trade agreements really wiped out the domestic textile industry.
So, Phil, this is Ed Smith with DC Nurses.
Hey.
Hi, and I have some similar some things in common with you. I did a little organizing down in Jackson, Mississippi for EMTs years ago, and then in West Virginia, in Bluefield, West Virginia, for EMTs, and I certainly understood the struggles, but I don't think that there was anywhere the titillating text I see from Chris on your on your interview looks to me that there was a lot of serious things. So, if you don't mind, tell us a little story about that you can recall that talks about some of the dangerous tactics or what you had to face and what outside the norm kind of strategies you used.
Sure. Well, one of the things that really marked this campaign as unusual is that ownership of the mill changed hands 3 times during a 1-year period. And it went from, in terms of the company's response to the union, from bad to terrible to completely off the gauge. And the final employer was, interestingly enough, a frozen vegetable company called United Foods that decided they'd wanted to expand into the textile business. And they flat out tried to bust the union. They reopened as a new company, basically did not hire any of the union activists within the plant, none of the committee, only one token shop steward. And so we were essentially locked out and on the streets. Jackson, at the time, had a long history of labor violence. There had been a lot of labor disputes in Jackson. Most of them had turned bloody. Actually, a business agent from our union had been blown away with a shotgun in the 1940s. And so we were dealing with some pretty ugly people. They had imported some non-union workers from Alabama to fill the jobs, who from Huntsville, Alabama, which is one of the most anti-union cities in the South at the time. So the mood, on the street in the community was very, very intense. When I would leave the union hall, the local president would make everybody stand around the grounds in a horseshoe until I got into my car and I'd driven safely away. I'm not paranoid, but I was sleeping with a loaded .38 draped over my bedpost. But one of the things that I'm proudest of, really, in my career is that I've been in quite a number of hot situations that could have very easily become violent. But nobody ever got a scratch in Jackson or in any of my campaigns. Because one of the things I really emphasized in the training of my local leadership and the rank and file in general was how to be ruthless in a fight, but without hatred.
We're talking with organizer and now author Phil Cohen. He's got a new book out, The Jackson Project. Phil, let me ask you, this is I don't want to say old story, but it's a story that's some years old, about an industry that has pretty much completely left this country. What are the lessons for the labor movement today?
Look, organizing is organizing. And regardless of what industry you're in or what period of history you're in, or even, frankly, if it's directly related to labor, good organizing is good organizing. And one of the things that I emphasize in the book is that what it's really about is the people. One of the pitfalls of folks who spend a career in the labor movement is over time they start to think of the members and the people